and fellow Rotarians and other friends. It's my honor today to introduce to you our Secretary of State in Colorado. So how did a poor girl living outside of Estes Park in a small house with no indoor plumbing, on food stamps, raised by a single mother, how did she get to where she is today? I know that she worked very hard, and she's had regular jobs since she was in the 7th grade. She worked her way through high school. No one in her family had ever been to college, but she worked her way through college. And then she graduated from one of the most prestigious law schools in the United States, University of Pennsylvania. She then had long been interested in election security and voter access. She became legal counsel to Barack Obama. And after that period of time, she went back briefly into private practice. But then in the mid-teens, she had the audacious idea that she would become Secretary of State of Colorado. And the youngest Secretary of State of Colorado, the first time she ran and was elected, she was reelected, and she's still the youngest Secretary of State in the United States. She's president of the National Secretaries of State Association. She fights for voter access and election transparency. She fights against dark money and foreign money in our elections. And her intelligence and competence are equaled only by her love of democracy and her personal graciousness. I introduce you to Jena Griswold.
Good afternoon. How are y'all doing? Good, good, good. Well, I want to say thank you for the President for personally inviting me to address you today. And gosh, what better introduction from Bobby when he says 2 times that I'm the youngest Secretary of State in the nation. So thank you, Bobby. That's what gets me through some of these long nights. No, I'm just kidding. Well, I just am honored to be here today, in part because Rotary has made such a major effect on my life. Bobby mentioned, I grew up in the canyon between Drake and Estes Park in a cabin with an outhouse outside on food stamps. And growing up, my mom, she'd worked 2 jobs, times were tough, so I started working the summer after 7th grade. Started scrubbing dishes at the old post office cafe in Estes Park. I graduated to hosting at Chelitos, one of the Mexican restaurants, to working in the fur and leather shop. And from such a young age, 2 things were very motivating. First, I saw a lot of families were just like mine, that they were struggling. And I wanted to have the tools to help out, so I wanted to go to college. But second, I wanted to see the world. And so I applied to be a Rotary exchange student, and I was selected. And I had been on my first plane ride in middle school. We did not travel. And Rotary decided that something in me was sparkling enough to send me a year in Argentina. So I learned Spanish. I started to learn Portuguese because I was so interested in language. I also saw a different way of life, not only in Argentina and South America, but living with professionals, living with attorneys, living with doctors, how to approach society in a different way. And so when I came home, back to waitressing, back to Estes Park, I realized that I could go to college. And not really knowing, when you grow up blue collar, how to do that, I do think the Rotary Exchange made a huge difference in my life. It made an attractiveness to schools. And then I, of course, went on to a 4-year college, first in my family, to law school, and then, as Bobby put it, to have the audacity at the age of 32 to run for a seat that someone in my party had not won in 60 years, to become Colorado's first Democratic Secretary of State since Eisenhower was president, one of the very few women ever to hold statewide executive office, and I think one of the national leaders on voting rights in a time when it has really mattered. Now, as Secretary of State, I've been very focused on increasing our election security and opening up our access. Over the last 5 years, we increased drop boxes by 65%. We added voting centers. We worked with the tribes so that the historical voter suppression of Native Americans in Colorado was addressed, and we started to reverse. We passed parolee enfranchisement, automatic voter registration, which has made our voter rolls more secure, but in doing that also registered 500,000 new voters since 2020. We've done a whole host of things. And then, a lot of those things I started to work on and pass my first year. And within a year of serving in office, 2020 arrives. The pandemic hits. And suddenly, life as we know it has changed. Democracy is at risk. Our elections are at risk. Because how will Americans vote if there is this global pandemic happening without a vaccine? But again, we were there. We were there to help states with the solution, which is our vote-by-mail system. We assisted nearly every state, consulted with them in expanding access to vote by mail, and even in the pandemic, this nation saw record turnout. Voters' voices were heard. We had the second highest turnout in the nation, but more importantly, all across the nation, people had increased access to vote safely during the pandemic. Democracy endured. But the attacks on democracy have not stopped. Colorado is considered a leader. We are considered the nation's gold standard in election administration. But even us, we have not been immune to some of the attacks we've seen. As Secretary of State, I addressed the first insider threat in the country, where a county clerk compromised their own voting equipment trying to prove the big lie. We actually had 3 security breaches because of disinformation in 2022. We've seen threats skyrocket against election workers and against people in my office trying to intimidate us, to try to scare people, good people, Republicans and Democrats, out of their job. And we've been there doing everything possible. On top of opening up access, increasing our security, we've been addressing these evolving threats as they come. I'm sad to say that I led the nation's first law on insider threats, making it a felony to compromise voting equipment in the state of Colorado, protecting whistleblowers, and making sure to send about $1 million in grants for increased security upgrades to the counties. I worked with the county clerks and led a law to make it a crime to dox or retaliate against an election worker for just doing their job. We also made it a crime to open carry close to a voting center or a drop box or where ballots are being processed, so our election workers and voters feel safe. In building on that progress, I actually just announced my 2024 legislative package yesterday, and I wanted to share that with you all. First, do you all know what deepfakes are? So there's a new technology, AI, which we believe has the ability to supercharge some of the threats we've seen against elections, both cyber threats and disinformation. And one of the new tools in disinformation is deepfakes. So it's using technology to make a person look like they said something or did something that they did not do or say. And when it comes to campaigns, it's really dangerous because sometimes these deepfakes, you can't tell that they're not real. It's really hard to tell they're not real. So imagine if suddenly you hear a call from the President of the United States telling you not to vote in his voice. That's just what happened earlier in the week. His voice was deepfaked. So this is an evolving threat. I was proud to announce that we're working with the legislature to regulate deepfakes against candidates and elected officials, while at the same time protecting First Amendment rights. So this bill will require a disclaimer so Coloradans know, hey, this content may not be fully real. And if there is not a disclaimer, there will be civil penalties through a campaign finance enforcement, and also a right for an individual affected to bring a lawsuit, including an injunction and money damages. We also announced new legislation, first in the nation, if enacted legislation, on fake electors. Fake elector schemes were put into prominence in 2020 as one of the efforts to steal the American presidency from the American people. When we vote for president, I know a lot of Americans think we're voting directly for the president, but we're actually voting for electors. Those electors are determined by our population and the number of congressional districts and Senate districts that we have. And when we vote for president, we're actually telling our electors how to cast the ballots for the state of Colorado. They have to follow state law. So what happened in 2020 is all these states had electors ready to cast a ballot for whichever presidential candidate won their state. But then rogue actors set up an alternative fake group of electors to try to delay certification with Mike Pence. I believe that if someone is trying to steal the presidency from the American people, and in doing so disenfranchises Coloradans, that action should be clearly illegal. So this new bill will make it a crime to conspire to create fake elector schemes or to become a fake elector. Anticipating, things that I hope do not happen, some of the things that we saw last presidential election that I hope we do not see, but if we do see them this election, we will be prepared. And then lastly, I mentioned one of the most heartwarming things I've done as Secretary of State is work with Colorado's two federally recognized tribes. The right to vote of Native Americans living on tribal lands was not recognized in Colorado until 1970. And although we have some of the highest registration rates in the country, we are often number one. We have some of the highest turnout rates in the country. Like I mentioned, 2020, we were second highest in turnout. That does not hold true for Coloradans living on tribal lands. So when I became Secretary of State, I began to partner with the tribes. We reversed historical voter suppression laws on registration. We guaranteed drop boxes, voter centers, early voting. We worked with the tribes and hired engagement folks into my office to do outreach to tribal members in a nonpartisan way, explaining their rights and how to engage the democratic system. We passed automatic voter registration with tribal membership list, which we're working to implement right now. And so in November, on the heels of this great relationship, I went down to Southwest Colorado to meet with the tribes to say, do you all have what you need going into 2024? And the chairman of the Southern Ute said to me, well, you know, we could use this, that, and the other, but what's going to happen when you're not Secretary of State? Because I'm term limited. What's going to happen because we have this great partnership? And I said, well, I can control what I can control, but ultimately that will be up to the next administration. And he said, well, he'd like a bill, a law that requires the Secretary of State's office to meet with the tribes periodically on topics of elections and voting rights. So we just announced that legislation yesterday to make sure that Native people continue to have a seat at the table. We do have to recognize the historical voter suppression and all the efforts that are moving this state forward, while at the same time recognizing that there's a long way to go. So those are some of the minor ways or major ways that we're addressing increased voter access, but also new and evolving threats to our democracy. I'm excited about this election cycle. We have 3 big elections this year, and just always honored to be Secretary of State because my goal is always to make sure that every eligible person, Republican, Democrat, unaffiliated, whether they grow up like me in rural Colorado, the big city, no matter how much money they have in their bank account or the color of their skin, that every single eligible person has access to free and fair elections. So thank you all for having me. It's an honor to be back with Rotary, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much for, is this on?
It's
Can
on.
you hear me? Thanks so much for your great work, Secretary Griswold. You mentioned that there are threats of violence against elected officials. That's on the rise. And that's, elected officials who are both Republicans and Democrats. How do you keep going? How do you stay strong? And how do you keep your staff going? How do you stay motivated?
Oh, well, thank you for that depressing question. No, I'm just kidding. I'm absolutely kidding. Because initially, when I first started to receive a lot of threats, elected officials don't love looking or being perceived as weak. And I had to work through the emotions of it's not weakness to stand up to people threatening you. And it's so important that Coloradans and Americans know what secretaries of state and election officials are going through. By the way, the majority of secretaries of state and election officials who have received these threats are women. So not only is it a risk to the stability of our elections, what we have seen is that the threats are scaring women from running for office. And in a state where we've never had a woman governor or a woman senator, where we have so many glass ceilings, for me, I had to stand up. I started to receive death threats the summer after the insurrection. We saw election deniers go county to county to county to the county clerks, demanding access to voting equipment. You can't just walk in and have access to voting equipment. That is a security breach. The county clerk said no, and that resulted in death threats. So I issued an emergency rule saying we are not going to have any unauthorized access to voting equipment. Congresswoman Boebert tweeted out that I'd stopped all bipartisan audits. That was retweeted by Senator Cruz, and then suddenly threat after threat after threat. Jena, what's the size of your neck because I want to measure the rope I'm going to hang you with? Your husband's going to have to tell your kids and your dog that you were hung because you're a traitor. Over and over and over and over. That started in July of 21. And a big turning point in the threat environment was, it was February or March of 2022, where a far-right group with John Eastman there, who's the architect of the insurrection, and it's a far-right group with a militia arm, held a rally calling for me to be hung. And I won't lie to you, it has been very hard. Initially, I had no state security protection. It felt like you're by yourself doing your job with people telling you over and over and over that how they're going to kill you. And you start to worry. You worry about your own safety. You worry about the safety of your family, about people around you. But to very clearly tell you why I continue to do the job and how I stay motivated is that I will never allow someone to try to intimidate me or the person that oversees our democracy and our elections to make it easier to steal elections. The threats in themselves are motivating to me. They in themselves are motivating to me. How is it in American society that it has been normalized that you can threaten people for doing their jobs in overseeing free and fair elections? With that said, we've set up programs where we are monitoring the threats against me and sending them to law enforcement. I ran a bill, like I mentioned, anti-doxing of election workers, making it a crime to push someone's address out there so they get intimidated or threatened. I had to run a law to get partial coverage of the Colorado State Patrol to make sure that I can do my job, future secretaries of state can do their job, but on top of that, that women feel that they can make a difference. So I won't tell you that it's not hard. It's something that I grapple with all the time. But we as a society cannot allow people trying to threaten to win. We can't. And we have to keep on going.
Hi, Secretary Griswold, thank you very much. I thought you were going to talk about, stuff like filing articles of incorporation and UCC1, so I'm a little disappointed, but in any event, is the information you have is, because we read a lot of stuff about threats to voting, and we read it both in the form of intimidation at the polling places as well as to the actual election counting machinery. Is the threat greater to the election counting machinery than to the polling, or is it? I'm just curious as to what you're looking at as the greater threat coming up in the 2024 election.
That's a great question, and I'll start with UCC filings. No, I'm just kidding. So the Secretary of State does a lot of other things. I oversee the business registry. We've done a lot to cut business fraud, and I didn't mention we're going to be running a business fraud piece of legislation this year. We've cut filing fees, whole host of things. I also oversee bingo and raffle, so make sure, Rotary, your raffle is compliant, or my team will be here. But to answer your question, I can't say. What I can say is we will have great elections. That's what I can say. What I can say is Coloradans will be safe in casting their ballot. But even that question, will I be safe casting a ballot, is a form of intimidation, right? And what we have seen, because you don't want people to think, I don't even want to go to a drop box because I'm scared. What we have seen is the lies and the disinformation come from the former President of the United States and be repeated from trusted elected officials. The American people should be able to trust their United States senators to tell them a basis of the truth. They should be able to trust their governors, their congresspeople, their secretaries of state. But we've seen these lies grow and grow and grow and become more normalized. And then they've been used as a basis to suppress the vote just this year. Not 2020, 21, 22, 23, just this, or 23. 14 bills to suppress the vote have been introduced across the country. We've seen the lies incite security breaches. Like I mentioned, that happened 3 times in Colorado, and I think you should rest assured that we discover them every single time because our election security is good. We had a security breach both in Elbert County and Mesa County because the elected county clerks were trying to prove those lies. We had a breach in Pueblo, we believe, because a voter was trying to prove those lies and stuck a USB into voting equipment. Voting equipment shut down right away because that's how it's supposed to work. I don't expect there to be those security breaches this election cycle. As much as I know, we do not have election denier county clerks, but there's always a risk. And that's why the security protocols of our voting equipment is so important. That's why we have the voting equipment checked by bipartisan teams of election workers. We have risk-limiting audits. We vote on a piece of paper. And so if anything happens, we will be there. And in the Mesa County case, first public insider breach in the country, I was there. I decertified all the voting equipment. I worked with the Republican county commissioners to get that former clerk removed from office. And then I asked my 2018 Republican opponent to take oversight of that county. And he did. County had great elections. So what I can say to you is that if there are security breaches, we will be there, but I anticipate none. In terms of violence, I think, unfortunately, you always prepare for everything. Most of the threats of violence are just that, it's threats. It's threats. And they have largely been targeted against me, and then to a lesser degree, but still very concerning, my staff and the county clerks. The problem with a generalized threat environment is you only need one person to act. I think at this point we have set up many precautions, but if there is any indication of an active threat, of course we take that very seriously. And again, I think we'll have great elections here. I also think this will be a hard election cycle. This will be a hard election cycle because we continue as a country to be in this atmosphere where unacceptable behavior is normalized, where lying with impunity is a political strength for some, and where there has not been enough accountability.
I want to thank you for your enthusiasm, even more your dedication. My question is regarding qualifications. And we really don't have qualifications for running our country. I mean, you might have to be a certain age or live in a certain place, but we have qualifications to get into college or to get into high-end, authority positions in corporations. Why do we not have qualifications, and is that something that could ever be implemented for a public office?
That's a good question. So when you said qualifications, I thought you were going to ask me about the big Supreme Court case we have, which asks the central question, is Donald Trump disqualified from the ballot for engaging in an insurrection? We're a party to that case. It's going to the United States Supreme Court. Oral arguments are on February 8th, and it's one of the biggest election cases in recent times. There are qualifications, residency, age, things like that. But I think our system is set up so that voters vet their elected officials. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we have to make sure that there are structural reforms. When you have endless amounts of dark money coming in and flooding the airways, well, then that dark money, those corporations, the billionaires trying to influence might have a bigger voice in the community. When you have voter suppression laws and elections that are hard to access, that demand that working people skip a day's work to be able to have their voice heard, well, then you're not going to have the right amount of engagement. When you have politicians able to kick out of their districts voters that they do not like through legal gerrymandering, again, you may not get to the result of a true representative who is representing the country. So I would suggest to get a better level of democratic representation, we have to strengthen our democracy. We have to say gerrymandering is not allowed. We have to say the people, normal community members should have the power and just as much power as big corporations. And we need to make sure that every person has access to free and fair elections so they can make their voice heard.
Jena, thank you, and I hope that someday you will be running as the youngest female president.
Oh.
But I personally, and you've touched upon, I'm not concerned about Colorado. I really am not, because there are people like you. But I'm very concerned, really concerned, that what's going to happen if somebody loses is going to be worse than the first time.
Yeah.
Because we have so many more, representatives in Congress and what have you that will play along. What's your feeling, and you understand this, what's your feeling about how concerned or not should I be about the rest of the country?
The rest of the country, gosh. I'm very concerned going into this election cycle. Not so much that something will happen with the election process itself, because, if it does, we'll be there to make sure that Coloradans have good access. But I'm very concerned with candidates who say they're going to be dictator for a day in a country based on the ideal that there are no kings. I'm very concerned about the rhetoric. To your point, I'm concerned about national leadership. The second person in line to the presidency is an election denier. With that said, I do have a lot of faith in the American people. We have seen election after election after election in swing states, swing districts, Americans stand up for fundamental freedoms and for the idea that no person is above the law, that we have this civil compact where we may disagree, but our disagreements are at the ballot box, and when those elections are over, we're all Americans. I think the American people really understand that. So with that said, it may not be a good, clear answer. I think we have to work really hard, and that is independent of your political affiliation. If you are concerned about our democracy, I encourage everyone to get involved with an NGO, a candidate, anything to help out this year, because no one person can save democracy. It takes all of us. But at the same time, I'm very optimistic that the American people will continue to step up and save our country for decades and years and centuries to come. Thank you.
A little bit different take on that last question. So again, I think because of your great work, those of us who reside in Colorado, I think feel very good about our election system. I guess my question is, again, I keep thinking I have faith in the American people too, and I hope that's going to be borne out this election season. But are you aware, in terms of other Secretary of States and around the country, we feel good because of what you just said, but if there are election deniers that are Secretary of State, and there are clerks that are county clerks, and what's your sense of what the rest of the nation or other states are doing?
You guys want to go down the dark hole of where we're at. That is a really good question, and I'm really glad that you have confidence in our elections. And just to comment on the first part of your statement, we have in-person voting, we have early voting, we have same-day voter registration, but overwhelmingly, we use vote by mail for all. And remember, when we rewind back to the dark times of 2020, the big lies were starting on vote by mail for all. And I want to highlight that we have been such a target of election disinformation. In that last election in 2023, over 98% of Republicans, Democrats, and unaffiliateds continued to use their mail ballot. So Coloradans do have faith in our elections. We are actually tied for #1 in terms of confidence in elections because we've, in part, are a great election model and we're always evolving. But in part, I've had my office really take disinformation head on in some interesting ways. Now, my answer to your question would be slightly different if you would have asked me in 2022. Because in 2022, we saw election deniers run for Secretary of State in nearly every swing state in the nation. So imagine someone who does not believe in free and fair elections, someone who does not believe that eligible people should have the right to vote, someone who won't counter the lies, someone who won't go into Mesa County and make sure the voting equipment is okay, at the helm of battleground states. I did lead the campaign effort to stop election deniers. We did stop them in Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada. So that was, I think, very important work. With that said, we stopped them in battleground states. We did not stop them across the nation. There are 5 to 6 secretaries of state who are now election deniers. Republicans who prior to 2020 would be labeled as conservative Republicans were primaried by the far right. In Wyoming, South Dakota, Indiana, across the nation, and a new group of secretaries of state emerged. And to your point, there are many elected election officials. Colorado has 63. 63 out of our 64 counties elect a county clerk. I am confident that here in Colorado, we'll have great elections, and I'm not aware of any election deniers. But again, it's part of the major concern. And when we talk about threats to election workers, we had a clerk where someone came into her office, slammed a gun on the table and said, "I know you stole the election, I want to see your voting equipment." A grandma by herself with another woman. That is scary, right? Elected officials who embrace the big lie and lies, and elected officials who refuse to condemn the lies and threats of violence are the people who are energizing the attack against democracy. I do think we'll have great elections. I do think stopping election deniers in battleground states was incredibly important. But at the same time, we are at a perilous point in our nation's history. And again, I would just highly encourage you, anything that you can do to stand up for democratic processes and institutions right now is imperative.
Jena, we have a tradition at Rotary that Rotary gets the last word. So I really want to thank you on behalf of this Rotary Club for your leadership, for your courage, for being an articulate and dedicated public servant, not only in Colorado, but throughout the country. So thank you for all of that. And on your behalf, we are pleased to donate 100 doses of a polio vaccine to try to eradicate this horrible disease from the world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, guys.
It's not too early to mark your calendar for the 2024 District 5450 Conference. Join Rotarians from 57 clubs in our district on Saturday, September 28, 2024 at the Colorado State University Spur Hydro Building in Denver. The focus of the program will be on Rotary's newest area of focus, the environment. Learn what Rotarians are doing on topics like sustainable living and agriculture, Rotary Firewise, Operation Pollination, and pollution and plastic waste. Save the date, Saturday, September 28th, 2024.
Are you looking for a free 6-week program that will cover leadership in a new way? Well, Rotary District 5450 has just the thing for you. RISE, Rotarians Inspired to Succeed and Engage, is a great program starting on Saturday, February 10th, covering some of the key practices you see up on the screen. You will learn to be a better leader and learn to be a better leader within Rotary. For more information, talk to President Carl or read the most recent district newsletter.
Community colleges are a cornerstone of higher education in the U.S. They account for nearly half of all college students, including the majority of low-income students, older students, and people of color. Higher education is changing post-COVID, and community colleges will play a critical role in the lives of American students. Next week, nationally recognized higher education leader and scholar Dr. Stephanie Fuji, the president of Arapahoe Community College, will talk about the future of community college in the U.S.
All together now. Have a great weekend.